Evening, everyone. My name is Sindiswa, and I'm the occupational therapist. And what the topic we'll be looking at today is we're going to try and understand addiction from how it progresses through habit and into addiction. So we're looking at how habits are formed and how those habits that are formed can lead to addiction. Okay, right. So the areas that we're going to cover in this topic, we'll be defining habits and the formation thereof of how the habits are formed. And we'll also be differentiating between habits and what is known as goal-directed behavior. So there's a difference between the two of those, and we'll look at what exactly the difference is between habits and goal-directed behavior. We'll also look at how habits can lead and become an addiction, which is the basis of the whole presentation. And we'll look at discrepancies between habits and goal-directed behavior in non-addicts and in addicts, because there is differences in the two within addicts and within non-addicts. And I'll show you the difference in this presentation. And we'll also be looking at how to form new healthy habits. Okay. So just to start off, we'll start off by defining what substance use disorder is and what we know as addiction. So SUD are commonly defined as chronic relapsing neurobiological disease characterized by compulsive drug use despite negative consequences. So when we look at compulsive, we are looking at two things, okay? So we're looking at number one, dissociation between an individual's thoughts and actions. So here it is, you get that the addict wants to stop, but they continue the drug use. So there is that dissociation between their thoughts and their actions. And we also look at the puzzling paradox of addictive behavior. So it's that persistence of drug use, knowledge. I mean, it's the persistence of using of the drug and the substance despite knowing the consequences that come from the usage of the substance. So those are the two things that we're looking at in terms of compulsive. That's what we mean when we say it's compulsive. Okay. So that is the definition of the substance use disorder. So having that in mind, we come and look at how addiction correlates to what we know as drug habits. Okay, so the similarities between the two is there's that persistence of drug use when it is no longer pleasurable and despite negative consequences. So it's that continued use for the substance, even though it doesn't bring any pleasure anymore and despite knowing the consequences. And it also looks at the high reactivity to drug associated use and context. And that's where habits comes in. And I'll go deeper on that, as well as addictive behaviors appear out of voluntary control. So over here in this slide, it's an indication of how addiction is similar to habits, how they correlate. Okay, so having looked at the definition of what addiction is, and now we're going to look at what habit is, but it's the similarities that resides between the two. Okay, so it has been long suggested that addictive behaviors could emerge from the progressive development and dominance of drug habits. Okay, so addiction results from the continued use of the drug habits. Okay, and in contrast to flexible goal-directed behaviors, which are performed because they're expected to produce some desirable outcome, habitual behaviors are characterized by rigid, inflexible, retrospective actions triggered by associated stimuli and performed in spite of their immediate consequences. So there's two words that are highlighted here, and goal-directed and habitual behaviors. So there's a difference between the two. There's a difference between goal-directed behaviors and habitual behaviors. And that's what we're going to be looking at more and saying, what is the difference? How is something goal-directed and how is something habitual? We'll be looking at that. But in the context of SUD or in addicts, if drug-seeking behaviors are habitual, then these behaviors should be insensitive to their associated negative consequences on the addict's life. So it seems to support that in addicts, their behaviors are more habitual as opposed to goal directed. And when we look at habitual, okay, okay, so now we're looking at habits. Now we're defining what habits are. So habits are regarded as rigid patterns of behavior that are automatically activated by context cues to which they have been mentally associated as a result of being frequently repeated in the past in a stable context. So it's that context of behaviors that we perform without thinking. It's the notion of acting without thinking. So this can be behavioral, related to motor skills. So habits, for example, is, just to put it lightly, if you see a switch and your first instinct is to go there and switch on the switch and the light comes on. It's a habitual behavior in the sense that you don't think about the outcome. You're not thinking about the light coming on. It's just you seeing the switch and you make that run forward and you switch on the light. It's habitual. You don't think about the action that you're taking towards it. Another example would be if you're driving, for example, and you're approaching stop sign, stop sign or a robot, you make the necessary changes in your car. So you get your foot off the accelerator and you go into the brake, and it's automatic. It's not something that you think about that, okay, now I need to move from here to there, because it's a habitual behavior. It's something that you've done so many times that it's now stuck in your mind. So that's what we say when we say something is a habit. That's what we're looking at. So it says that it's considered as the expression of a stimulus response association. So what that means is there is a stimulus that triggers a response. So in the example, it's seeing that red light and then you knowing what to do. So there's that stimulus response association. It's seeing the switch and then knowing that I need to switch on the switch. It's stimulus response association. So that's what we mean when we talk about habits. It's a stimulus res- response association. Okay, so repetition of a given behavior in the same situation through practice or overtraining facilitates the formation of a habit. So, for example, the first cigarette after waking up or the glass of wine with the dinner are good illustrations of habitual and automatic drug taking responses established through repetition and closely to contextual and conditioned stimuli. So, what that means is habits are formed through repetition. So the more you repeat something, the more it becomes a habit. For example, the the moment you wake up in the morning and you feel like the cigarette, so the more that that is repeated, the more it becomes a habit, and that's how habits are formed. It's that stimulus and response association, and that is done through repetition. It creates that habit. So with addicts, that's how we see it starts off small and it just grows with the repetition. It then becomes a habit. So when we describe someone as doing something by pure or blind habit, we mean that they do it automatically without having to mind what they're doing. It's acting by habit is merely a replication of automatic response to a cue learned by repetition. So getting that cue, you automatically know what to do. Okay. When done enough times, the entire action gets coded in the brain as a chunk and a complete, which is known as a complete and automatic set of actions that occur without conscious decision. So going back to my example of saying you're seeing a red robot and you automatically know what to do. Okay. I get my foot off the um, accelerator onto the clutch, press down, go down to gear one, go to brake. So those sequences through repetition eventually become what we call a chunk, that they come all together automatically at once. Through that repetition, you're able to form that chunk. Okay, so how are habits formed initially? So um, habits are formed when you see a cue. So there's something, there's a stimuli that you see that triggers something in your brain that causes a reaction. So it's seeing that switch that causes you to switch on the switch that causes then the reward of seeing the light switch on. So doing that repeatedly, having that cue, doing that routine facilitates a formation of a habit. So with addicts, it's seeing that substance, taking that substance, and the high that they feel afterwards from that substance creates that habit within them. Okay. Some habits, however, can be bad in the sense that they may drive systems to situations that are contrary to its own survival or well being. So they are habits that, if done too much, could injure your biological being. So, for example, addiction is one, the habit of constantly drinking every time you have a meal causes injury to your biological body, the liver, the system in there. So those are the habits that we look at as we define as bad habits. So looking at what bad habits are is a habit whose expression, while positive for its own continued self-maintenance, is negative for a person's well-being because it consistently overrules the expression of other situationally relevant actions and habits. So this is what we call bad habits. Okay, it is possible that a bad habit comes to dominate a person's way of life to an extent that even biological viability is compromised. So it goes back to the example that I just gave of constantly drinking every time with the meal. Every time you're having a meal, then you drink. It affects your body biologically in terms of performance as well as your internal systems as well. So this is what we say is bad habits. So if we look at habits in addiction, addiction is one of the many habitual identities that constitutes an addict's form of life, and that is so deeply ingrained into the addict's physiology that it alters their metabolic autonomy and escalates to dependence. So that drug seeking or that behavioral tendency of wanting to engage in the substance creates that habit that forces it into addiction. So it forces it now becomes a dependence. What started off as a habit now moves into a dependence, which is now addiction. Thus, addiction is a bad habit in the sense that it jeopardizes or severely restrains the expression of some of the person's regional identities that are relevant for their overall well being, such as biological and social ones. So it's a bad habit in the sense that addiction starts to take over their social aspects as well as their biological aspects as well. This could be affecting some of their occupations, be it work, be it their performance at home. So it's an addiction, it's a habit, it's a bad habit that affects some of their overall well being. Okay, so it is known that there's a relation between habits and self. Consider that habit has a power over us because it is so intimately a part of ourselves. It has a hold upon us because we are the habit. All habits are demands for a certain kind of behavior and they constitute the self. So each individual has certain habits that make them unique. So there's certain things about each one of us that we do that make us unique. So that constitutes to the self. There's certain ways of doing things that are habitual to each one of us. So if we look at addiction as well as it being a habit, it kind of comes back to self, that there's this bad habit that is now a part of oneself. So that's what this section is saying here, that the habits form a part of self. It's your way of being, it's your routine. They form a part of us. Thus, the normativity that guides behavior is centered on maintaining this addictive identity, making it utterly difficult for addicts to exert self control. So, this habit takes control of addicts. They're unable to shift or control it. And we'll look more into what exactly happens that gets them to that point where they're unable to shake that bad habit that now leads it to addiction. So earlier on, I spoke about goal directed and habits. So when we're looking at behavior, we're looking at behavior as either being goal directed or being a habit. So when we say goal directed behavior, we mean behavior that is orientated towards obtaining a particular goal. So it's behavior that's centered towards the end. Your response, how you interact is all with the goal, the end goal in mind. That's what we say is goal directed behaviors. Whereas with habits, habits is not goal directed as they persist despite the devaluation of a goal. So, as I mentioned earlier, with habits, we look at stimulus and response. It's seeing the alcohol and then taking it in. So it's not thinking about the outcome of if I take or drink this bottle of wine, what will happen, which is what goal directed behavior would be, is to think about if I were to consume this bottle of wine, what would happen. But with habits, it's not like that. It's seeing, triggering something in the brain, instantly going for the bottle. And that's what happens with addicts. It's seeing the bottle or the substance, whatever it is that they're engaging in, and they just go for it. It's not a goal directed behavior. Okay, so unlike goal directed action, habits are divorced from the motivational value of the goal. They do not depend on awareness, but are instead triggered by conditioned stimuli without or perhaps in the face of any recruitment of higher cognitive processes such as decision making. So it becomes a habit in the sense that it doesn't involve any cognitive um, functioning. Okay. Whereas with goal directed behaviors, there is those cognitive functioning of decision making, judgment, looking at if I were to drink right now, what would the consequences be? And that is what we call goal directed behavior. That's what we mean. It's those high executive cognitive functions coming into play, looking at the broader picture overall. If I were to engage right now, what would happen in future? And with addicts, it's never that case. It's a matter of now and then. It's habitual. They don't look at what would happen um, in the future, what would the consequences be for me engaging in this substance? It's a matter of I see it, I want it, I'm taking it. That's what it is. Habits. And habits are therefore difficult to inhibit in the presence of their eliciting stimuli. So once something becomes a habit, it is hard to shake off. And we all know this by if we can reflect on the habits that we have. If something is habitual to you, such as first thing if you wake up in the morning, you brush your teeth, it's hard to shake that off. If it's in you, it's in you. Once it's elicited, you go for it. And that's how it is as well with addicts. Once that stimuli is there, it's hard to shake it off. They need to go for it. Okay, so if we look at how a habit becomes an addiction, any behavior that is repeated stimulates the release of dopamine in the brain's reward pathway, can also form a habit. So with addiction, it's that release of dopamine, it's that seeking of dopamine. With habits as well, it's also like that. It's that reward pathway that creates, that releases dopamine, can also form a habit. Thus, the activity is rewarding and we want to do it again. When we use substances that give us a big bang of dopamine, the temptation to use it repeatedly is strong. Our brains quickly associate the behavior pattern with the sense of pleasure. So it's taking in that substance, having that high rush of dopamine. So it creates that repetition. And as we look at the definition of addiction, it's that compulsiveness use of the substance. And if we look at the meaning or the definition of a habit, it's also just that repeated use of the substance. And through more usage of the substance, it now moves from being a habit to an addiction. Okay. With addictive substances or behavior, the intensity of the reward and the cost of not having the reward move from the user move the user from habit to addiction. So knowing how that substance makes you feel, knowing the rewards that you get, I say rewards in quotation marks because it's not really rewards, but just knowing how you feel when you get that substance, it now moves it from just pure habit to now an addiction where you want to now get this constantly. When people are addicted, we talk about the power of craving, which goes beyond merely wanting. Craving sets up powerful physical sensations, emotions, and a cognitive focus on obtaining the substance. So, how to measure if something has moved from a habit to an addiction? If you look, for example, like I mentioned, we all have our habits. If you don't perform a particular habit. For example, if you wake up in the morning and your habit is straight off bed, you shower or you brush your teeth. If that particular morning you wake up and you have to do something else, you eat, it breaks you off from your habit. And it feels a bit odd. It feels quite weird because you're now used to doing things a certain way. So if they don't happen that way, it feels odd. With addiction, however, if you don't take it, it now creates a craving, whereas with habits, doesn't create a craving. And that's where the difference lies, that now it has now moved from a habit to an addiction where there's that craving now involved, where now we've moved from just feeling uncomfortable from not taking or not engaging in the habit. It has now moved into addiction where it's we've now moved into addiction where there's craving involved. So the brain, it's because the brain has grown accustomed to the presence of the substance, and without it, um, imbalances in the brain's function occur. Okay, so more on the how a habit becomes an addiction. Drug-seeking behaviors begin as a goal-directed behavior. So initially, there's that action of wanting to find and take drugs, and then that leads to a particular outcome of the drug high. That's how it starts off as a habit. So it's that stimulus response, which then moves. So this type of associated learning is mediated by the area of the brain that is associated with reward processing. In this kind of learning, devaluing the outcome by decreasing the potency of the drugs, so decreasing or them not getting the same high, as before does not affect them anymore. They still want the drug. So it moves away from being a habit into an addiction, such that the outcome of it not being pleasurable still drives them to use. Now it has become an addiction. However, in long-term abusers, this devalued outcome does not reduce the action. So goes back to when the drug isn't as strong as they thought it would be or how it used to be, they still continue to use it. And it that's what it means with addiction, that it has now moved into an addiction. It's no longer quite a habit, it's just that addiction now, of even if it's not as pleasing as before, but they still just want to engage in it. Okay, so this is just to show how it moves from being a goal directed behavior. So, where initially, when we took substances or when they engaged in the substance use, it was goal directed, in the sense that they wanted to, for example, feel better, may have been. So the use was for an outcome. Okay, I want to feel better, so that's why I'm using. Then it thins out into going over onto recreational drug use, where now I'm using every time I'm with friends. Then it goes on to even when I'm not with friends, I'll use, as a chronic drug user, I'm using when I'm not with friends. Then it goes on to drug abuse. So the frequency just keeps increasing. And that's where the habits come in, where it's seeing, taking. It's no longer thinking about the goal or the outcome of it anymore. It's a matter of, if it's here, I want it, I want to take it now. Okay. So it goes from being goal directed behavior, thins out into drug abuse, and then drug addiction right in the center there. Okay, so how are these goal directed systems in individuals who are non addicts? So the goal directed system remains available if one makes the decision to reduce cigarettes or wine consumption. In an extensional goal directed control can be exerted over habitual systems to adjust the behavior. So what this means is that with non addicts, they are able to um, fix and falter their habitual systems to reach their goal. So they still have that control of looking at their goal. So if someone says that they want to reduce smoking, they are able to reduce the habitual systems that they have in order to reach that goal of reducing the cigarette smoking and the wine taking. Whereas with individuals who are addicts, they don't have that control. So the second section says that with non-addicted individuals, um, can do that with varying success and can control their drug intake, because there is a balance between goal-directed and habitual systems. So there is that balance between goal-directed and habitual systems. They are able to look at the goal and, in light of the goal, shift their habitual systems. There's that balance. If we look at addicts, for example, there is a disruption in the balance, okay? And its persistence in drug use could then be explained by, number one, abnormal formation of habits. So with them, there's that just that abnormal formation of habits. Number two, there's an impairment in goal-directed behaviors. Number three, there's deficits in goal-directed control over habits, or a combination of these processes. It has been shown that drugs can promote the formation of habits. An acute or chronic intoxication to various drugs causes critical changes in the brains, which is responsible for executive functioning, things such as judgment and decision making, that contribute to the shift from goal directed to habitual drug seeking behavior. So, as I mentioned in the previous slide, that with individuals who are not addicts, there is that balance between goal-directed behaviors and with habitual behaviors, whereas with addicts, the scale tips a bit. It becomes more habitual as opposed to goal-directed. That's why they are unable to look at the consequences that would result from their substance use because the habits weigh more than the goal-directed behavior. So it says that although the formation of new SR associations, which is stimulus response associations in drug addicts, is not altered, their ability to overcome familiar SR associations is disrupted, as indicated by more preser- preservative responding after a change in contingency. So what it states here is that there is no disruption in them being able to form new habits. They are able to form new habits. It's just, it's harder to shake off old habits. It takes a long time because of the disruptions that have been caused in the brain. So it's harder to get rid of the old habits, but they can form new ones. Okay. Drugs, conditioned stimuli can also elicit cravings, as we mentioned earlier, for drugs through the conscious representation of the outcome, including the satisfaction produced by the drug. Behavior is then goal directed. This goal directed choice could, however, trigger an automatic sequence of behavior that would be habitual and insensitive to the outcome. So, for example, the goal directed choice of going to the bar to get a drink may lead to an automatic sequence of drinking glasses of alcohol, one after the other until the dawn. The smell of smoke can elicit a smoking desire, whether conscious or unconscious, which can then trigger a motor program leading to the action of smoking. And once the decision of smoking or drinking is made, breaking the sequence is very hard because every action naturally and logically follow the previous one without further deliberation. So it goes back into when we spoke about chunking of actions, where actions now follow each other chronologically without any awareness or consciousness of it. So once the decision has been made of engaging in the substance use, it's harder to shake the sequences that come afterwards. And that's what a habit is. Okay, so interestingly, the shift from goal directed behavior to habits induced by drugs of use does not require high exposure or extended drug self administration. So it's not to say the more you expose to substances, then the more you be closely or likely to become an addict. It's something else. So indeed, moderate doses or limited exposure are sometimes sufficient to promote habitual responding. Okay, so if drug-induced habits do not require heavy drug use and are not specific to drug-related behaviors, how could it lead to compulsive drug seeking specifically? So if it's not measured according to the more you use, then you're more likely to um, form or become an addict. Then how is it that people end up seeking these drugs? And the line of thought that we need to apply here is that behavior is what is central in moving something from habit to addiction. Behavior is becomes more rigid. So behaving more and acting more according to the habit, it starts to become more and more and more fixed. And that's how the transition happens from a habit into addiction. Okay, so drug addicts become more prone to develop routines or SR associations, and this tendency interacts with everyday choices in real life situations. Repeated exposure to drug associated contexts or drug associated stimuli in addicts may facilitate behavior in response to these drug contexts and conditioned stimuli. more specifically. Okay. So impaired goal-directed control may explain drug addicts' difficulty in considering future negative consequences of drug-related behaviors and could bias choice towards more immediate drug gratification. So as explained earlier that with individuals who are non-addicts, there is a balance between the two. And with addicts, the balance shift, and this is caused by um, the changes in the brain that are caused by the constant release of dopamine, that reward seeking, that causes that changes in the balance. Furthermore, certain situations or contexts can prompt individuals to express habit, and failures in response inhibition could then interfere with individuals' ability to exert goal-directed control over that habitual responding. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, we're having a look now at how at the top graph there's a balanced control of performance. So this is how with non-addicts, this is how it presents. There is that goal directedness and there is the habits, and these two coexist parallel to one another. Okay, so there is that equality of the two. There isn't one that outweighs the other. Whereas with addicts, it's one of the three at the bottom, where the habit becomes, it weighs more than the goal. So it's doing something out of pure habit. It doesn't consider the goal. Hence, we can see that there's areas of the goal-directed behavior pointing down. There's no value of the goal at all. It's just coming out of pure habit. Okay, so in conclusion, goal-directed control is impaired after chronic drug exposure. According to the disrupted self-control account, Herbert would be abnormally strong, but would be expressed more frequently as a result of an impaired goal directed and inhibitory control. So it goes back into this system that the habit would not necessarily, so it's explaining more what's happening in the second graph, that it would not necessarily be graph number C is what I mean. It would not necessarily be bigger than the goal directed. It's they weigh roughly the same. It's just habit tends to prevail over goal directed behavior. Drug seeking responses are prompted by the situation rather than rejected based on an evaluation of their predicted consequences because the goal directed system is disrupted. So this is what we mean when we say it's a habit. They engage in the use of the substance despite the consequences because they don't even consider the consequences. It's rather them wanting that substance in the here and then and wanting to engage in that substance and not caring about the effects thereof. Drug addicts would persist in habitual drug seeking despite negative consequences because they have failed to predict and consider these negative outcomes, even though they know that they exist. So, in knowing that there is negative consequences, they still yet choose to engage in the substances because it becomes habitual. When engaged in habitual drug seeking behavior, drug addicts would have difficulty in re exerting goal directed control over their behavior because of failures in the inhibitory control. So they are unable to control the urge to get that substance, hence why they they're unable to control, pardon, their behaviors for them to obtain that substance. So they're driven by we want to take the substance. We don't care about what happens with the consequences later. So they're unable to regulate their self in terms of consequences and what would happen if I engage in this. It's habitual in we want to take it here and now. Under non-pathological conditions, so these are your non-addicts, goal-directed and habitual processes operate parallel and complement each other to control decision-making and performance. So it goes back into here that these graph A, that habit and goal-directedness behaviors can coexist with one another in equilibrium. Repetition and practice in stable situations promote the formation of habit, but in situations that warrant deliberation, such as changes in environmental contingencies, individuals can re-exert goal-directed control over habits to flexibly adjust their responding. So this is still in relation to non-addicts. If they make that goal, they are able to adjust their habits in order to meet their goal because these two systems operate in parallel to one another. Thus, transitions between habit and goal-directed control are biodirectional, and the control of behavior by the systems can be balanced. This balance is disrupted in SUD as a result of abnormal formation, deficits in goal-directed behavior, or a combination of both. So the disruption in individuals, in addicts, causes them to favor more habits than goal-directed. So their behaviors then become more of a habit than goal-directed. So how do we then form new healthy habits? So there is pharmacological treatment that blocks specific dopamine receptors to dispute the reward processing circuits in the brain, and those that induce plasticity in brain regions associated with habitual drug-seeking behavior. So there is medication that facilitates plasticity in the brain that can allow for new habits to form, and those that block the dopamine receptors that favors drug-seeking behaviors. And also another one is to practice mindfulness. And this is the core one where the addict needs to practice mindfulness. And what do we mean by mindfulness? We mean the mental state achieved by focusing one's awareness on the present moment. So it's in that moment where if an addict is used to having a glass of wine with dinner, it's in that moment of, okay, I'm in the dinner table and I'm having my meal, but instead I'll have something else. I won't have meal. I'm here in the present. I know being at the dinner table triggers me to want to get a drink, but I'm trying to revert my thoughts and think otherwise. And that's what we mean by mindfulness. It's being in the here and now, knowing that, okay, this is what used to trigger me to drink. Now I'm trying to get away from that and develop a new way of dealing. So it's determining what the triggers are and staying away from those thoughts and behaviors. And also another one could be practicing inhibition and avoidance. So avoidance would be if you know there's a place where you regularly used to go to, or a park that you used to go to, if you know that if you are around that area, it would elicit that kind of response to you to go in there, it would be best for you to avoid it. So it's forming a new habit by avoiding the area that you used to go to that induced the habitual behaviors. And in all honesty, it takes on average 66 days to break a habit through continuous repetition. So in despite of knowing or having heard that it's roughly 21 days, in actuality, on average, it's 66 days, could be even longer, 90 or even more. So it takes time to break a habit. But the most important thing about breaking a habit is continuous repetition. It doesn't help starting today, then tomorrow reverting, doing something different. It's that consistency and continuous repetition that forms or breaks a habit. Just like we said earlier on, that it's through repetition that a habit is formed. So to breaking a habit as well, it's the consciousness and continuous repetition of a stimulus that will cause it to form and be a new habit.